Welcome to WooEnglish, where we bring you captivating stories that help you learn English in a fun and engaging way. Our stories are designed to use clear and simple sentences, making it easy for you to follow along. We encourage you to leave your comments below. Let us know what you think. And don't forget to hit the like button to support our channel. It really motivates us to create more content for you. Remember, these stories are not just entertaining. They're also educational, designed to help you improve your English skills. Enjoy the story. Chapter 1. A Boy by the Sea. The sea whispered his name. The year was 1460. In the small coastal town of Sines, Portugal, a boy was born, a boy destined for greatness. His name? Vasco da Gama. But he was not just any boy. The wind from the Atlantic Ocean blew through the streets, carrying with it the smell of salt and the promise of adventure. The sea was never quiet in Sines. Its waves crashed against the rocky shore, a constant, powerful reminder of the world beyond. And for young Vasco, the sea was more than just water. It was a call, a challenge, a dream. Even as a child, Vasco would run down to the shore, his bare feet sinking into the wet sand. He would stand there, staring out into the distance. His heart raced as he imagined ships sailing over the horizon, heading to unknown lands. "What's out there?" he would ask his mother, his eyes wide with wonder. Isabel, his mother, smiled softly. She had stories. Oh, so many stories. She would sit with him in the evenings, the fire crackling beside them, and speak of distant lands, of spices that smelled sweeter than anything they could find in Portugal, of gold shimmering in the sunlight, and of strange people who lived beyond the seas. Her words were like magic, and Vasco listened, hanging on to every sentence, every pause. His imagination soared. He could see it all so clearly. The ships, the treasures, the glory. "One day, Mama," he whispered, "I'll see it for myself. I'll sail beyond the horizon." But it wasn't just dreams that shaped him. Vasco's father, Estevão da Gama, was a knight, a man of honor, duty, and courage. Estevão had served the King of Portugal, fighting for his country, protecting its lands. From him, Vasco learned discipline. He learned strength. He learned what it meant to stand tall, even when faced with danger. Estevão didn't speak of distant lands or treasures. He spoke of responsibility. "The world is bigger than you think, Vasco," he would say, his voice firm but kind. "And if you want to be a part of it, you must be prepared." But how could Vasco prepare? He was just a boy, after all, a boy who dreamed too big, who wanted too much. Yet the sea kept calling, louder and louder each day. The people of Sines knew Vasco well. They watched him grow, watched as he became more restless with every passing year. He was not like the other boys. While they played in the streets or helped their fathers in the fields, Vasco would sneak away to the docks. There he would watch the sailors with their weathered faces and calloused hands. He would listen to their stories of storms, battles, and survival. They spoke of places like Africa and India, places Vasco had only heard about in his mother's tales. "One day," he told himself, "I'll be one of them. I'll sail further than anyone has ever sailed before." But there was a problem. The world wasn't an easy place for a young boy with big dreams. Portugal at the time was a country on the edge of discovery. King John II had sent ships down the coast of Africa, trying to find a way to the rich lands of India, but no one had succeeded. The sea was dangerous, unpredictable. Many had tried, and many had failed. Yet Vasco wasn't afraid. The fear of failure never entered his mind. Instead, he felt a strange excitement, a thrill deep in his chest. The unknown didn't scare him. It excited him. As the years passed, Vasco grew taller, stronger, and more determined. His father taught him the ways of a knight, how to fight, how to lead. But it was his mother's stories that fueled his ambition. The combination of his father's discipline and his mother's tales created a fire inside him that could not be extinguished. The sea was in his blood now. By the time Vasco reached his teenage years, he knew one thing for certain. The sea was not just a dream, it was his destiny. He would not spend his life on the shores of signs. No, the world was too vast, too rich, too full of wonders for him to stay behind. He had to go. He had to explore. But how? How does a boy from a small town become a legend? The answer, he knew, lay beyond the waves. And Vasco was ready to find it, no matter the cost. Every morning, he would wake before the sun rose. He trained, he studied, he learned. His mind was sharp, his body strong. And always, always, the sea called to him. It whispered his name in the wind, in the waves. Vasco, Vasco. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The boy who once dreamed of distant lands was now becoming a man ready to conquer them. His heart was set, his path clear. The horizon no longer seemed far away. Chapter 2. The Shaping of a Sailor. Every hero is forged in the fires of youth. Vasco da Gama was no stranger to adventure. As he grew older, the small, sleepy town of Signs became too quiet for him. His world was getting bigger, and so was his hunger for the unknown. The ocean was calling him louder than ever, and he couldn't ignore it. But Vasco wasn't alone in this desire for more. He was surrounded by men of the sea. Traders, sailors, adventurers, all of them telling tales of distant lands, perilous journeys, and unimaginable riches. Their stories were full of excitement, danger, and possibility. One day, his father, Estevão, took him on a journey that would change everything. To Lisbon, the bustling heart of Portugal. The capital was alive with activity. Ships from every corner of the world filled the port. Their white sails stretched out like wings, billowing against the wind as if eager to take flight once more. They carried spices, silk, and gold, but what they carried most of all were dreams. Vasco's eyes sparkled as he stood there, watching the sailors unloading their treasures and loading new goods for their next voyages. One day, he whispered, that will be me. He could feel it in his bones. The pull of adventure was like a current, and he knew. He was meant to follow it. His father saw the spark in Vasco's eyes. This is only the beginning, son, Estevão said, his voice steady and full of pride. The world is vast, but it's only those who dare who will ever see it. These words would stay with Vasco for the rest of his life. But becoming a sailor wasn't just about dreaming of voyages. It required knowledge. It required skill. So, while the other boys spent their days playing in the streets, Vasco was different. He threw himself into his studies. Mathematics, astronomy, and navigation became his new world. For many, these subjects were tedious, a burden even, but for Vasco, they were the keys to unlocking the mysteries of the ocean. Night after night, he would lie awake, staring at the stars above him. He traced their patterns with his fingers, whispering their names under his breath. Polaris, Sirius, Vega. Each star had a story to tell, each one guiding the way for those brave enough to follow. Vasco's mind raced with the possibilities. What if there's a faster route to India? He thought. What if there's a way no one has discovered yet? He began to imagine new paths across the sea, new worlds waiting to be found. His heart burned with ambition. The stars weren't just distant points of light. They were a map to his future. As he grew older, his education only deepened. He learned to calculate the position of the sun, the movements of the moon, and how to use the simplest tools to navigate the most complex routes. The astrolabe, the quadrant, these instruments became extensions of his own hand. He could feel the rhythm of the earth beneath him, the pull of the tides, the whisper of the winds. "I'm ready," he would think. But still, he was young, and the world was not ready to give up its secrets just yet. Every day in Lisbon, he watched the ships sail off, bound for Africa, for the Azores, for places beyond the reach of the average man. And with every ship that disappeared on the horizon, Vasco's determination grew. He would be the one to sail the farthest. He would be the one to go beyond where others had dared. "One day," he promised himself, his voice quiet but certain, "I will sail farther than anyone before me." But promises alone wouldn't be enough. Vasco knew this. He had to be prepared, both in body and in mind. His father continued to teach him the ways of the night: strength, discipline, leadership. These were the qualities of a man who would command a ship, who would lead a crew through the unknown. The sea could be brutal, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Vasco had heard the stories of sailors who never returned, of ships lost to storms, swallowed whole by the ocean's wrath. But these tales did not frighten him. They fueled him. The greater the danger, the greater the reward. He would not be content with half measures or simple victories. No, Vasco da Gama wanted it all. And so, day by day, Vasco trained. His hands grew rough from working the ropes of small boats, his eyes sharp from watching the stars, and his mind quick from solving the puzzles of the sea. Yet even as he learned the science of sailing, there was something more driving him. Something deeper. A feeling in his chest, a fire in his heart, that no amount of study could explain. He was not just meant to sail, he was meant to discover. Even when he slept, his dreams were full of the ocean. Dark waves crashing, winds howling, and the stars lighting his way. He could feel the ship beneath his feet, feel the sails catching the wind, and hear the creak of the wood as it cut through the water. Every night, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. He could almost taste the salt on his lips. And every morning as he awoke, he knew that he was one step closer to making those dreams a reality. Vasco's ambition was not a quiet thing. It roared inside him, pushing him forward. He could not and would not be content to live an ordinary life. His eyes were always on the horizon, on the world beyond the waves. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be storms, both real and metaphorical. There would be challenges, doubters, enemies, but none of that mattered. For Vasco da Gama, there was only one path forward, the path that led to the sea. And so, with every ship he watched sail away, with every calculation he made, with every star he traced in the sky, Vasco's future became clearer. He wasn't just preparing for a journey. He was preparing for destiny. He would sail farther. He would discover new worlds. He would write his name in history. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop him. Chapter 3. A Father's Dream Passed Down. The weight of a legacy rests heavy on young shoulders. Vasco da Gama grew up in the shadow of a great man. His father, Estevão da Gama, was not just a knight, not just a servant to the king. He was a man with a dream that consumed him, a dream that lived day and night in his heart. To discover a sea route to India. India, the land of unimaginable wealth. Spices so rich you could smell them before you even saw the ships arrive in Lisbon. Silk softer than any fabric in Europe. Gold and jewels beyond measure. But it was more than riches that drew Estevão. It was the chance to make history. To unlock the doors to the East. to open a new path that would change the world forever. But the sea is cruel, and fate even crueler. Estevão da Gama had tried. Oh, how he had tried. He had petitioned the king, prepared for voyages, planned routes, studied maps. But it was not to be. His life was cut short, his dream left unfulfilled. When the elder da Gama passed away, it was as though the dream of India was buried with him. Or so it seemed. But dreams like that don't die so easily. Vasco, still a young man at the time of his father's death, felt the loss deeply. His father had been his mentor, his guide, his example of strength and honor. Now he was gone, and with him the chance to reach the East? No. Vasco couldn't accept that. He wouldn't accept it. The dream of India still burned in his heart, brighter than ever. It was no longer just his father's dream. It was his own. He stood at his father's grave, the wind howling around him, the sea crashing in the distance, his hands clenched into fists as he spoke, his voice low but firm. I will finish what you started, Father. I will find the way to India, and I will not fail. But how? How could a young man, no more than 25, achieve what so many before him had failed to do? Vasco knew that his father had come close, so close, but the pieces hadn't come together. The king's support had wavered. The resources had fallen short. The right moment had slipped away. But Vasco was determined to make sure his moment would not slip through his fingers. He would seize it. Still, the weight of his father's legacy rested heavily on his shoulders. Estevão da Gama was respected, admired, a man of honor. How could Vasco, so young, so unproven, carry that burden? He couldn't just be good. He had to be the best. He couldn't just dream. He had to act. He spent hours poring over the maps and charts his father had left behind. They were old, marked with notes in Estevão's hand, routes that had been considered, dangers that had been noted, calculations that had been made. Vasco studied them endlessly, memorizing every line, every possibility. He missed something, Vasco muttered to himself again and again. There's a way. There must be a way. But it wasn't just about finding a route. It was about convincing the world, convincing the king, convincing the sailors, convincing himself that it was possible. Vasco knew that his father's failures had left doubts in the minds of many. People whispered that the dream of reaching India by sea was foolish, dangerous, impossible. But Vasco would prove them wrong. He had to. As the years passed, the dream only grew stronger. Vasco honed his skills, preparing himself for the day when he would set sail. His father had taught him many things, and now without him, Vasco had to rely on his own strength, his own knowledge, his own drive. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, doubt would creep in. What if I fail? Vasco would think to himself in the dark of night, the stars outside his window mocking him with their distance. What if the route doesn't exist? What if my father was wrong? Then, as if his father's spirit were speaking to him, Vasco would remember his words. The world is vast, son, and if you want to be a part of it, you must be prepared. Estevão had never doubted the dream, and neither would Vasco. One day, while walking along the docks in Lisbon, Vasco stood watching the ships come and go as he always did. The salty breeze tugged at his hair. The sound of the waves echoed in his ears. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the sea wash over him. This was his element. This was where he belonged. And suddenly, he knew, truly knew, that his time was coming. The sea is waiting for me, he whispered, opening his eyes. It's been waiting all along. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. In 1497, King Manuel I, desperate to find the sea route to India, called upon Vasco da Gama. Estevao's dream was still alive in the royal court, and now the king looked to the son to fulfill the father's mission. It was a heavy responsibility, perhaps too heavy for most men. But Vasco was not most men. He stood before the king, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the moment, the gravity of the task before him, it was all too real. But Vasco stood tall, his father's memory beside him. The king's words were clear, and they struck like lightning. You will find the sea route to India. This was it. His chance. His father's dream, his dream, was no longer a distant hope. It was a command. The king had chosen him, Vasco da Gama, to change the course of history. And Vasco swore there and then, with the king watching, with the spirit of his father alive in his heart, I will finish what my father started. I will not fail. Chapter 4. Tides of Ambition. Ambition is a storm that rages within. Vasco da Gama was no longer a boy dreaming by the sea. Now he was a man with fire in his heart and ambition burning in his veins. As he entered his 20s, everything began to change. The world, once so full of stories and fantasies, was now shifting, moving towards something real, something powerful. The winds of change were blowing across Portugal, and they were strong, relentless. King Manuel had set his sights on the east, on India. The riches of India were no longer a distant dream, they were an obsession. Spices, gold, silk, treasures that could elevate Portugal to unimaginable heights. But there was one problem. No one had yet discovered the sea route. The land routes were dangerous, controlled by hostile forces, impossible for the Portuguese to navigate safely. What Portugal needed was a path over the ocean. The sea held the key, but who was brave enough to unlock it? The whispers in the royal court began. Names floated through the halls like leaves caught in the wind. Who would take on this impossible task? Who would be daring enough, bold enough, ambitious enough? One name surfaced again and again: Vasco da Gama. His reputation had grown. People knew him, not just as Estevão da Gama's son, but as a man in his own right. A man driven by the very same dream that had consumed his father. The king had taken notice. How could he not? Here was a man, young, strong, hungry for adventure. The sea called to Vasco, and now, so did his king. The time for dreams has passed, Vasco whispered to himself one night, staring out at the dark ocean, the waves crashing like thunder in the distance. Now, it's time for action. The ambition inside Vasco da Gama was no quiet flame. It was a storm that raged within him, pushing him forward, driving him to take risks that others would never dare. But ambition is a dangerous thing. It can lift a man to greatness or destroy him. Vasco knew this well, but the fear of failure was nothing compared to the pull of his desire to succeed. Every morning, he woke with the same thought: India. He would be the one to find the way. He would sail where others had turned back. He would succeed where others had failed. There was no other option for him. It wasn't just about riches or even glory. It was about destiny. As the days passed, word spread that the king was close to choosing someone to lead the voyage. The anticipation was thick in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Sailors, explorers, and noblemen alike watched and waited. Would it be them? Would they be chosen for this monumental task? The pressure grew, and so did the stakes. But Vasco was not a man who waited idly. He prepared. He trained. He studied the maps, even the ones marked with danger and death. He consulted with astronomers and navigators, learning everything there was to know about the stars and the seas. He listened to the stories of sailors who had ventured down the African coast and to those who had barely survived the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. Knowledge, he knew, was power. And Vasco wanted every advantage he could get, but ambition was something that couldn't be taught. It came from within, like a force of nature, and Vasco had it in abundance. Finally, the moment came. King Manuel summoned Vasco to the royal court. The halls of the palace were grand, filled with tapestries of past conquests, paintings of great men who had achieved great things. But today, it was Vasco's turn. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the throne, but his face remained calm, determined. He was ready. The king's voice echoed in the chamber. "Vasco da Gama," he said, his eyes fixed on the young man before him. "The time has come to open a new path to the east, a path that will secure Portugal's future. I have chosen you to lead this voyage." Chosen. The words hit Vasco like a wave crashing against the shore. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had prepared for all his life. He bowed deeply, but his mind was racing. The dream was real now. The weight of the task settled on his shoulders, but it didn't crush him. No, it lifted him. He was ready. "I will find the way to India," Vasco swore, his voice steady, his eyes burning with determination. "I will not fail." But deep down, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. It would be long, dangerous, filled with unknown perils. The sea was not kind to those who dared to challenge it. It could turn from calm to fury in the blink of an eye. Storms would rise, waves would tower, and enemies, seen and unseen, would threaten his every step. Yet Vasco felt no fear. Ambition coursed through him like the wind through the sails of a ship. It pushed him forward, faster, harder, determined to conquer whatever lay ahead. "I was born for this," he thought. "Everything in my life has led to this moment." As he left the court that day, the whispers followed him. Some called him brave, some called him reckless. Some admired him, others doubted him. But Vasco didn't care what they said. His path was clear, his mission set. The storm of ambition within him was raging stronger than ever. The seas were waiting, the horizon beckoned, and the world beyond Portugal's shores was about to change forever. Vasco da Gama's time had come. Chapter 5. The Call of the King. History waits for no man, but it calls to some. The year was 1497. Portugal stood on the edge of a new era, and King Manuel I had made up his mind. The time for hesitation was over. The time for boldness, for action, had come. The summons came to Vasco da Gama like a bolt of lightning. He had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, dreaming of it. But now, as it arrived, it felt surreal. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the royal palace in Lisbon, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Would this be it? The moment his life would change forever? The palace loomed before him, its grand walls and high towers rising like giants above the city. Inside, the air was thick with tension, whispers, and anticipation. Courtiers and nobles watched as Vasco, the son of a knight, entered the halls of power. They knew why he was there, but still, no one could predict what would happen next. As Vasco approached the throne room, his thoughts swirled. The journey ahead, the dangers that lay at sea, the unknown waters beyond Africa, and the distant, mysterious shores of India. Everything hinged on this one meeting. He straightened his shoulders, calmed his breathing. This was no time for doubt. He had prepared his whole life for this. The doors to the throne room swung open. Vasco stepped inside, his boots echoing against the polished marble floors. At the far end of the room, seated on a gilded throne, was King Manuel I. The king's face was calm, but his eyes held the weight of the kingdom. They pierced through Vasco, assessing, measuring, calculating. Vasco bowed deeply, but inside, his nerves danced like flames in a storm. This is it, he thought. My chance. My destiny. The king's voice cut through the silence. Vasco da Gama, he said, his tone steady but filled with purpose. Portugal stands on the edge of greatness. Our future lies to the east. India holds the key to that future. And you, Vasco. The king paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You will find India by sea. The words hit Vasco like a wave crashing against rock. You will find India by sea. There it was, his mission, his fate. His dream was no longer just a fantasy. It was an order, a command. The entire kingdom's hopes now rested on his shoulders. For a moment, Vasco felt the crushing pressure of it all. The distance to India was vast, the ocean unpredictable, filled with storms, monsters, and dangers unknown. Many had tried to reach the east before him. All had failed. Could he succeed where so many others had not? But then, as quickly as the fear crept in, it was drowned by something far more powerful, the thrill, the intoxicating thrill of the challenge. This is what I've been waiting for, he thought, his heart racing with excitement. This is my moment. Vasco's eyes met the king's. He straightened, his voice calm but full of resolve. I will find the way, Your Majesty, he said, bowing once more. I will not fail. The king nodded, satisfied. The fleet is yours, Vasco. 3 ships, fully equipped. Choose your crew. Prepare for the journey ahead. The future of Portugal rests in your hands. Vasco could hardly believe it. The fleet was his. The ships, the crew, the responsibility, it all belonged to him now, and with it, the chance to change history. As he left the throne room, the weight of the task set in. The court was alive with whispers. Some admired him, some envied him, and others doubted him. But Vasco didn't care. His mind was already racing ahead, planning, strategizing, preparing. The journey would be long, the risks great, but the reward was beyond imagination. Outside the palace, the sun was setting over Lisbon, casting golden light over the city. Vasco stood at the harbor, looking out at the ships that bobbed gently in the water. Soon those ships would be his. Soon they would set sail for the unknown. The sea, vast and endless, stretched before him, both a challenge and a promise. India, Vasco whispered, the word barely audible. It was so close now, and yet it was still a world away, but Vasco was not afraid. The ambition that had burned inside him since his youth was now a roaring fire. I will find the way, he repeated to himself, his jaw set, his eyes on the horizon. No matter the cost. In the days that followed, Vasco worked tirelessly. He chose his crew carefully, men who were strong, brave, and skilled. He made sure the ships were ready, every rope tied, every sail repaired. Supplies were gathered, provisions packed. There was no room for error. The sea did not forgive mistakes. As the day of departure grew closer, the weight of history pressed down on Vasco more heavily than ever. The eyes of the entire nation were on him now. His father's dream, King Manuel's command, and the hopes of Portugal all rested on his success. But Vasco thrived under pressure. History waits for no man, he reminded himself. But it calls to some. And it had called to him. Finally, the day arrived. The harbor was filled with people. Crowds gathered to watch the fleet set sail. The air buzzed with excitement, tension, and fear. The 3 ships, São Gabriel, São Rafael, and Berrio, stood ready, their white sails gleaming in the morning light. Vasco stood at the helm of São Gabriel, his face calm, his heart full. The time for dreams had passed. The time for action was now. With one final glance back at the city of Lisbon, Vasco da Gama gave the order. "Set sail," he commanded, his voice firm and unwavering. And so the journey began, a journey that would take Vasco across uncharted waters, through storms and trials to the distant shores of India, a journey that would change the world forever. The ships pulled away from the harbor, their sails catching the wind, the ocean stretching out before them like a blank page waiting to be written upon. Vasco da Gama stood tall, the weight of the kingdom on his shoulders. But his heart, it was full of fire. The call of the king had been answered. Now, history awaited. Chapter 6. Setting Sail into the Unknown. The sea, vast and unforgiving, awaited its challenger. On the morning of July 8th, 1497, the sun rose over Lisbon, casting a golden light over the city. The streets were alive with excitement. Crowds gathered along the docks, their voices rising in cheers, their faces filled with awe and anticipation. They had come to witness history, the beginning of a journey that would either lead to glory or to ruin. But no one knew which. Standing tall on the deck of his flagship, São Gabriel, was Vasco da Gama. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with the weight of what was about to happen. The air was thick with the smell of salt and wood, the cries of seagulls circling above. Behind him were the cheers, the hopes of an entire nation. Before him, the unknown. Vasco gripped the wooden rail, his eyes fixed on the horizon. 3 ships stood ready, São Gabriel, São Rafael, and Berrio, each one packed with supplies, their sails full and eager to catch the wind. Behind him, a crew of 170 men moved like a well-oiled machine, each one knowing their role, each one aware of the dangers they faced. They were bound for India, but between them and their destination lay the most treacherous journey any of them had ever faced. The vast Atlantic, the unforgiving Cape of Good Hope, waters no European had ever conquered. As the ropes were untied and the ship slowly began to drift from the dock, Vasco could feel the cheers of the crowd fading. Their voices, once so loud, now became whispers carried away by the breeze. Lisbon, his home, his past, began to shrink into the distance. All that was left was the open sea, endless, mysterious, and full of danger. "This is it," he thought. "There's no turning back now." The sails snapped to attention as the wind caught them, and with a creak and groan, the ships moved forward, cutting through the water with purpose. The journey had begun. Ahead lay the Atlantic, vast and cold. The crew, seasoned but nervous, worked tirelessly, their faces betraying a mix of excitement and fear. They had heard stories, whispers of monsters in the deep, storms that could tear a ship apart, and waters so wild that no man could survive them. But Vasco was not afraid. "The sea is our only path," he had told them, his voice steady, his eyes burning with determination. "We will find the way." For weeks the fleet sailed south, following the western coast of Africa. The sun beat down on them by day, turning the decks hot and unforgiving, while the nights were cold, the stars twinkling in the black sky like distant guides. Vasco spent most of his time on deck, his eyes always on the horizon, his thoughts always on India. But the sea is a cruel teacher, and it was not long before it showed its teeth. One morning, the sky darkened. A storm. The clouds, once light and innocent, turned into thick, rolling masses of gray and black. The wind howled, whipping at the sails with fury. The waves grew, rising higher and higher, crashing against the sides of the ships like giants trying to swallow them whole. The crew scrambled, their hands gripping the ropes, their voices shouting orders over the roar of the storm. The ships rocked violently, tilting dangerously as the waves pounded them again and again. Water spilled over the deck, drenching the men, making it nearly impossible to keep their footing. But Vasco stood firm. His heart raced, but he did not waver. He had prepared for this. He had known the sea would test him. "Hold steady," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've faced worse storms than this." But had they? The sea, vast and unforgiving, was showing them just how small they really were. The ships were at its mercy, their wooden hulls groaning under the pressure, yet somehow they pressed on. The sails, though battered by the wind, stayed intact. The men, though terrified, held their ground. For hours the storm raged. The sea seemed determined to break them, to send them into the deep, never to return. But slowly, the storm began to weaken. The waves shrank, the wind calmed, and the clouds, once so menacing, began to drift away. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting its light over the calm water, the men collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies bruised and soaked, but alive. Vasco stood at the helm, his hands still gripping the rail. His clothes were drenched, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were full of fire. They had survived. The crew, though battered and shaken, looked to their captain with a newfound respect. They had seen the worst the sea could throw at them, and yet here they were, still afloat, still moving forward. "The sea won't stop us," Vasco muttered under his breath, his jaw set with determination. "It can try, but we will reach India." But this was only the beginning. The storm had been a test, a taste of the trials to come. They still had to face the dreaded Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost tip of Africa, where the seas were said to be even more ferocious. They still had to cross the vast, uncharted Indian Ocean. But Vasco's resolve only grew stronger with each passing day. He spent his nights studying the stars, plotting their course, watching the waves and winds with the keen eyes of a seasoned sailor. His mind was always moving, always calculating. India was still so far away, but to him, it felt closer every day. As they continued south, rounding the African coast, the crew began to trust their captain more and more. They had seen his strength, his leadership. He was not just another sailor. He was a man on a mission, a man who carried the weight of Portugal on his shoulders, a man who refused to fail. Weeks turned into months, and the endless horizon stretched out before them. They had come so far, but the most dangerous part of the journey still lay ahead. Vasco knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. But he was ready. For him, there was no turning back. The sea, vast and unforgiving, awaited its challenger, and Vasco da Gama was ready to meet it head on. Chapter 7. Battles with the Elements. Man versus nature. Who would triumph? Weeks turned into months. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken horizon that seemed to taunt them. Vasco da Gama's fleet sailed south, further into the unknown. The sun scorched them by day, while the nights brought a chill that bit through their bones. It was not the sea of their imagination. It was far more dangerous, far more unforgiving. The men grew restless. The journey was harder than any of them had expected. Each wave seemed higher than the last, each gust of wind more fierce. The ships creaked and groaned under the constant strain, their wooden frames tested by the sheer force of nature. Some days, the ocean lay calm, as if it were holding its breath. But more often than not, it raged. Towering waves crashing over the decks, drenching the crew, pulling at the sails with violent hands. "Hold steady!" Vasco shouted above the roar of the wind, his voice cutting through the chaos. His hands gripped the helm, steady as a rock, while the ship bucked and swayed beneath him. His face was set, his eyes locked on the horizon. He knew they had to endure. "We will survive," he told his crew again and again, his voice filled with iron resolve, "for we have no choice but to succeed." But the elements were relentless. Storm after storm hammered the fleet. The sky darkened, heavy with clouds, and the winds howled like wild beasts. The sea was no longer just water. It was a living, breathing enemy, determined to sink them. Waves rose as high as the masts, crashing down with deafening force. The men struggled to hold on, gripping ropes, pulling the sails, their faces pale with fear. Every man was soaked to the skin, their clothes clinging to them like second skins, their bodies bruised from being tossed around the deck. Some grew sick. The endless motion of the ships made their stomachs churn, their faces turning green as they leaned over the side, retching into the sea. Others despaired, their hope sinking as fast as the sun on the horizon. "Will we ever see land again?" they whispered in the dark, their voices filled with doubt. Many doubted. Many feared. But not Vasco. His will was iron. The storm raged around him, but inside he was calm, focused. He had prepared for this, both in body and mind. Failure was not an option. He knew the sea would test them, push them to their limits, but he also knew that they would endure. "Hold fast!" he shouted to his crew, his voice ringing with command. "We've come too far to turn back now." One night, in the middle of a particularly brutal storm, when the wind howled like 1,000 demons and the waves rose like mountains, some of the men thought they wouldn't survive. The ships were tossed around like toys in the hands of an angry child, their wooden frames shuddering under the weight of the water. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos for brief moments. Flashes of men scrambling on deck, ropes snapping, sails tearing. But Vasco stood firm, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "We will survive," he repeated, his voice steady despite the storm's fury. "We must." And somehow, they did. The storm passed, the waves calmed. The wind, exhausted from its rage, died down to a gentle breeze. The men, battered and bruised, looked around in disbelief. They had survived. They were still alive. The ships, though damaged, still floated. The sea, it seemed, had tested them, and they had passed. But there was no time to celebrate. Ahead of them lay their greatest challenge yet, the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost tip of Africa, a place where the seas were said to be more violent, more unforgiving than anywhere else on Earth. No European had ever sailed around it successfully. The waters there were wild, unpredictable. The winds roared like beasts, and the waves rose higher than any man had ever seen. But Vasco was determined. In November 1497, the fleet reached the Cape. The sky was dark, the wind howling, the waves rising in angry swells. The men's faces were pale with fear as they stared at the churning waters ahead. Some whispered prayers, others clung to the rails, their knuckles white. Vasco, standing at the helm, stared at the Cape. His heart pounded, but his face was calm. This was it. The moment they had been sailing toward for months. The moment that would decide whether they would succeed or be swallowed by the sea. "Ready the sails," he commanded, his voice firm, cutting through the fear like a knife. The crew scrambled into action, their fear forgotten in the face of his certainty. The waves grew higher, the wind whipped at their sails, threatening to tear them apart. The ships creaked and groaned under the pressure, their wooden frames straining against the force of the ocean. But still, they pressed on. The sea fought them with everything it had. Towering waves crashed over the decks, drenching the men, threatening to pull them into the deep. The wind screamed in their ears, filling the sails with wild, unpredictable gusts. The ships pitched and rolled, their masts swaying dangerously, but Vasco stood firm. His eyes never left the horizon. His hands never left the helm. "We will make it," he muttered, his voice filled with steely determination. "We must." And slowly, painfully, they began to round the cape. For hours the sea fought them. For hours the crew battled against the elements, their bodies exhausted, their faces streaked with sweat and salt water. But little by little, they pushed forward. Little by little, they conquered the cape. And then it was over. The waves calmed, the wind died down. The sky, once dark and filled with storm clouds, began to clear, revealing a horizon that stretched out endlessly before them. They had done it. They had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Vasco, his hand still on the helm, let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had survived. They had conquered the Cape. But as the men cheered, as they collapsed in exhaustion and relief, Vasco knew that their journey was far from over. The sea had tested them, yes, but there were more tests to come. Still, they had faced the worst the ocean could throw at them, and they had survived. And now, India awaited. Chapter 8. The African Coast. Friend or foe? Every encounter could mean fortune or death. The coast of Africa stretched out before Vasco da Gama and his fleet, a rugged line of land where the ocean met mystery. For months they had sailed south, battling storms, battling the sea, battling their own fears. Now they sailed along the unknown shores of a continent both feared and admired. Africa was a land of secrets, a place where danger and opportunity lived side by side. Vasco knew that every port, every encounter, could change the course of their journey, could determine whether they would succeed or perish. The first ports they reached were small, scattered settlements, far removed from the bustling cities they hoped to find. The people there were wary, their eyes dark and unreadable as they watched the strange ships approach. The men on board the fleet held their breath. They had heard stories of fierce warriors, of hostile kings, of entire crews disappearing into the jungle, never to be seen again. But Vasco's voice was calm, firm. "We come in peace," he said again and again, as they anchored their ships and approached the shore. His hands were open, but his eyes remained sharp. His cannons were hidden, but always ready. The first encounters were tense, the language barriers thick. They had only a few translators, and communication often came down to gestures and guesses. The locals, native peoples and Arab traders, watched them with suspicion, as Vasco and his men offered gifts of cloth, beads, and mirrors. Some were curious, their fingers brushing the strange fabrics and polished glass. Others turned away, their faces hard, their mouths set in silent refusal. Fortune or death, Vasco thought, his heart beating a little faster as each encounter unfolded. That's what every moment brings. At one port, the ships were welcomed with gifts, fruits, spices, fresh water, and a cautious smile. The local ruler, dressed in bright robes and gold, seemed curious about these strange visitors from the north. Vasco bowed respectfully, offering gifts of his own, and spoke of trade, of peace, of journeys to distant lands. He knew the art of diplomacy, knew that a kind word could be as powerful as a cannon blast. The ruler nodded, offering safe passage through the waters for Vasco and his fleet. That night, there was a feast, laughter filling the air as the sailors tasted new foods, their spirits lifting after so many months at sea. The tension in their bodies eased, but only slightly. Vasco didn't let his guard down. Not yet, because not every encounter was so welcoming. Further down the coast, at another port, the ships were greeted with suspicion. The locals watched from a distance, their hands resting on weapons, their faces hard. When Vasco and his men stepped onto the shore, their gifts were met with silence. The ruler of this land was no smiling host. He eyed Vasco with distrust, his fingers tapping against the hilt of a sword as Vasco spoke of peace and trade. "Why are you here?" the ruler asked, his voice low, his eyes narrow. "What do you seek?" "Passage," Vasco replied, choosing his words carefully, his voice calm but firm. "We are bound for India, and we seek only safe passage through your waters." The ruler didn't respond right away. He studied Vasco, his eyes searching for weakness, for signs of deceit. The tension was thick, so thick that the sailors on the ship stood ready at their cannons, their hands trembling on the ropes, waiting for a signal from their captain. But Vasco didn't blink. "We come in peace," he said again, his voice unwavering. "But we will defend ourselves if we must." For what felt like an eternity, the ruler was silent. The only sound was the wind and the distant crash of the waves against the shore. Then finally he nodded, a single stiff nod, and turned away. The message was clear. They could pass, but they would not be welcomed. As they sailed away from that port, the tension in the air remained. The closer they came to India, the more dangerous the waters became. The coast of Africa was not just a place of mystery. It was a place of power struggles, of rivalries, where every ruler had their own interests, their own secrets. And Vasco knew that the wrong move could mean disaster. But his will was iron. "We will survive," he reminded his crew. "We must." Further up the coast, they encountered Arab traders, seasoned sailors who had traveled these waters for centuries. These men knew the sea like the back of their hands, and they weren't easily impressed by Vasco's fleet or his ambitions. The traders eyed the Portuguese ships with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Do you truly believe you'll find India?" one of the traders asked, his voice skeptical as he stood beside Vasco on the deck of São Gabriel. "I don't believe," Vasco replied, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know." The trader chuckled, shaking his head. "Many have tried," he said, his tone warning, "but the sea does not give up her secrets easily." Vasco didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was its own answer. Days passed, and the African coast continued to reveal its secrets, some friendly, some hostile. They traded with some ports, while others refused to even let them anchor. Tensions ran high, and at times it seemed as if the fleet would have to fight its way through. Every encounter could mean fortune, or death, Vasco reminded himself. He knew that the decisions he made now would determine their fate, whether they would reach India or whether they would be swallowed by the sea, their bones lost to the waters forever. But Vasco wasn't just a sailor. He was a leader. He had learned that diplomacy was as important as navigation, that a kind word could open doors that brute force could not. Yet, he also knew that in these waters, strength was respected. And so, even as he spoke of peace, his cannons remained ready. His men were prepared to fight if it came to that. "We must be ready for anything," Vasco told his crew, his eyes sharp, his voice filled with resolve. "We are close now, but the closer we get, the more dangerous this journey will become." The African coast faded into the distance behind them, but the tension remained. Ahead lay the vast, uncharted Indian Ocean, and beyond that, India, the land they had been sailing toward for months. But the question lingered in the air, hanging over the fleet like a shadow. Would they find the route they sought? Or would they meet their end in these foreign waters far from home? Only time would tell. Chapter 9. Arrival in India, a dream realized. Land ho, the sight of destiny. The day had finally come. After nearly a year at sea through storms, sickness, fear, and doubt, Vasco da Gama stood on the deck of his flagship São Gabriel, staring at the horizon. His heart pounded in his chest. His eyes squinted against the rising sun, and then, through the morning mist, he saw it. Land. But not just any land. This was India. The land he had dreamed of since his youth. The land his father had spoken of, filled with spices, gold, and treasures beyond imagination. "Land ho!" came the cry from the lookout, his voice ringing through the air like the sound of destiny itself. The crew, exhausted but alive, rushed to the deck. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, followed Vasco's gaze toward the distant shore. The coast of India. It was real. The dream was real. Vasco's hands gripped the wooden rail of the ship, his knuckles white. For months they had sailed through treacherous waters, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, crossing the vast and dangerous Indian Ocean. Now, at last, the long journey was ending. They had made it. The exotic port of Calicut appeared before them, a bustling city filled with life and color. The scent of spices, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, filled the air, carried by the breeze from the markets that stretched along the shore. This was what they had come for. This was the gateway to wealth, to power, to glory. But Vasco knew this was only the beginning. As they sailed closer, the ships carefully navigating the foreign waters, the sounds of the port grew louder. Voices shouting in languages they did not understand, the clamor of markets, the cries of traders. The city was alive with activity, a hub of trade between the East and the rest of the world. Ships from distant lands filled the harbor, their sails bright and colorful. Merchants from Arabia, Africa, and beyond moved through the streets, haggling for the spices that filled the air with their rich, intoxicating scents. "India," Vasco whispered under his breath, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We're here." The crew, too, was filled with excitement. After months of hardship, they were eager to set foot on land, to see with their own eyes the riches they had heard so much about. But Vasco's mind was already racing ahead. Landing was just the first step. The real challenge lay in securing the riches they sought. And for that, he would need to face the Zamorin. The Zamorin was the local ruler of Calicut, a powerful figure who controlled the trade in the region. Vasco knew that he would not be easily impressed. Many had come before him, seeking trade and wealth, and many had failed to win the Zamorin's favor. Vasco needed to tread carefully. He needed to show strength, but also respect. Diplomacy would be as important here as his courage had been on the seas. The ships dropped anchor, and a small boat was lowered into the water. Vasco, along with a handful of his most trusted men, climbed in, their eyes fixed on the bustling port ahead. As they rowed toward the shore, the reality of the moment settled over them. This was it. This was the moment they had fought for. The dream of a sea route to India, once a distant hope, was now within their grasp. As they stepped onto the dock, the heat of India hit them like a wave. The sun beat down from above, and the air was thick with the smells of the market. Traders moved past them carrying baskets of spices, silk, and jewels. The noise of the city surrounded them, a cacophony of sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. But Vasco remained calm. His face was set, his eyes focused. He had come too far to let this slip away. They were escorted to the palace, a grand structure that rose above the city, its walls adorned with bright colors and intricate designs. Inside, the air was cooler, and the sound of the bustling port faded into the background. But the tension remained. The Zamorin sat upon a throne surrounded by advisors and guards. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied Vasco as he entered the room. He was no stranger to foreign traders, no stranger to those who sought the riches of his land. Vasco bowed, his movements respectful but confident. He was here as a representative of Portugal, a nation eager to trade, but also as a man determined to succeed where others had failed. "We come in peace," Vasco began, his voice steady and clear. "We seek trade, an alliance that will benefit both our nations." The Zamorin said nothing at first. His gaze remained fixed on Vasco, as if weighing his words, his intentions. The silence was thick, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable. The crew standing behind Vasco shifted uncomfortably, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. They knew that this moment could change everything. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and their dream could crumble. But Vasco did not waver. He had faced storms, battles, and the wild, unforgiving sea. He had not come all this way to fail now. The Zamorin spoke at last, his voice low, but commanding. "What do you offer?" And there it was. The negotiation had begun. Vasco offered the gifts they had brought from Portugal, fine cloth, silver, and other treasures from the West. The Zamorin examined them, his face giving little away. Vasco knew that these gifts were only a starting point. What the Zamorin truly valued was power and trade, long-term access to the riches of Europe. But even as they spoke, Vasco could sense the underlying tension. The Zamorin was powerful, and he was used to being in control. Vasco needed to show respect, but also strength. He could not afford to appear weak. Days passed, and the negotiations dragged on. Vasco and his men worked tirelessly, navigating the delicate balance between diplomacy and pressure. At times, they offered trade deals and promises of wealth. At other times, they hinted at the power of Portugal's navy and the consequences of refusing their offers. And slowly, the tide began to turn. At last, after days of back and forth, the Zamorin agreed. Trade between Portugal and India would begin. The sea route had been secured. The dream, the very dream that had driven Vasco since his youth, was now a reality. Vasco da Gama had done it. As he stood on the shores of India, the exotic port of Calicut bustling behind him, the weight of the moment settled over him. He had fulfilled his father's dream. He had found the sea route to India. But more than that, he had changed the course of history. The journey had been long, the trials many. But Vasco knew, as he watched the sun set over the horizon, that this was only the beginning. India had been reached, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 10. Return as a hero. Not all voyages end where they begin, but all heroes must return. The journey home. It was no easier than the voyage out. The thrill of reaching India had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of the sea once more. Vasco da Gama's ships, once proud and strong, were now battered by the long months at sea. The wood creaked with every wave. The sails, patched and worn, barely caught the wind. The men, they were exhausted, their faces pale and thin, their bodies weakened by scurvy and illness. Many had already perished. their graves the unforgiving depths of the ocean. Yet still they sailed on. The Indian Ocean, once full of promise, now felt endless. The journey seemed eternal, each day bleeding into the next. The waves that had once carried them toward destiny now seemed determined to crush their spirits. And yet, Vasco stood firm. "We will make it," he told his men, his voice steady, though his body ached with fatigue. "We must." His words were iron, his will unbreakable. The crew, though weary, took strength from their captain. Vasco had led them through storms, through treacherous waters, through battles with the unknown. They trusted him. He had not failed them yet, and they would not fail him now. But the journey wore on. The sun scorched their skin by day, while the nights brought a bitter cold that chilled them to the bone. Scurvy spread through the crew, its cruel grip tightening on those who had already been weakened by the long months at sea. The men's gums bled, their teeth loosened, their bodies ached. Many fell, unable to rise again. The sea, vast and unforgiving, claimed them. Each death weighed heavily on Vasco's heart. These men had trusted him with their lives, and while he could not control the sickness that ravaged them, he felt their loss deeply. But even in the face of despair, Vasco kept his eyes on the horizon. He knew they were close. They had to be. And then, one day in the spring of 1499, the coast of Portugal appeared in the distance, a thin line of hope against the endless blue of the sea. Vasco's heart raced. Home! After nearly 2 years at sea, after all they had endured, they were returning. Lisbon, the place where it had all begun. "Land ho!" the lookout cried, his voice filled with relief, with joy. The men, those who remained, staggered to the deck, their eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment there was silence. Then a cheer erupted, weak at first, but growing louder, stronger, until it filled the air, carried by the wind back to the shore. They had done it. They had survived. As the ship sailed into the harbor, the people of Lisbon gathered at the docks, their voices rising in excitement, in awe. The news had spread. Vasco da Gama had opened the gates to the east. He had found the sea route to India. The wealth of the Orient was now within Portugal's grasp, and this man, this boy from Sines, had made it happen. Vasco stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the familiar sights of his homeland. The city was alive with celebration, banners flying, trumpets blaring, but Vasco's face remained calm, almost distant. He had dreamt of this moment, of returning home as a hero, since he was a child. And yet, now that it was here, it felt strange, unreal. The ship docked, and as Vasco stepped onto solid ground, the crowd erupted into cheers. "Vasco da Gama," they shouted, "hero of the seas, discoverer of India." The king himself awaited him at the palace, ready to reward him for his incredible feat. Vasco was showered with honors, titles, and riches. He was made admiral of the Indian seas, given lands, and treated as a living legend. The boy who had once gazed at the ocean, dreaming of distant lands, was now the man who had brought those lands to Portugal's doorstep. But as the celebrations continued, as the wine flowed, and the people cheered his name, Vasco's mind was elsewhere. He had opened the sea route to India, yes, he had fulfilled his father's dream and his own. But the journey had changed him. He had seen the brutality of the ocean, the fragility of life. He had led men through storms, watched them fall to sickness, and carried the weight of their deaths on his shoulders. The sea had tested him, and though he had triumphed, he was not the same man who had left Lisbon 2 years earlier. As the crowds cheered, as the city celebrated, Vasco stood quietly, watching the sunset over the harbor. His heart was full of pride, but also something else, something deeper. The journey was over. But his story was not finished. For Vasco da Gama, the sea still called. Its vastness, its mystery, still whispered to him, just as it had when he was a boy. There were more journeys to be made, more discoveries to be found. The world was bigger than even he had imagined. And so, even as the people of Portugal hailed him as a hero, even as the king honored him with wealth and titles, Vasco knew that his place was still out there, beyond the horizon. He had returned as a hero, but heroes, he knew, must sometimes leave again. Chapter 11. A Return to the East. Once the sea has you, it never lets you go. The year was 1502. The sea, vast and unrelenting, called to Vasco da Gama once more. But this time it was different. He was no longer the young explorer, wide-eyed with wonder and ambition. He was now an admiral, commanding a fleet of 20 ships. He was not returning to discover. He was returning to conquer. Vasco stood on the deck of his flagship, São Gabriel, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sails billowed in the wind, and the ships behind him followed in a majestic line. 20 ships, 20 warships, ready for battle. The peaceful trader who had once sought alliances with the rulers of the East was now a warrior, a commander whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. The mission? To establish Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean and crush any resistance. King Manuel had sent Vasco not just to trade, but to control. The seas between Portugal and India would belong to no one else. It was not just about wealth anymore. It was about power. The men aboard the fleet knew it too. They were not here for diplomacy. They were here for war. The cannons were primed, the swords sharpened. The sea was no longer just a path. It was a battlefield. Vasco, now a legend across the oceans, had earned the respect of his men and the fear of his enemies. He had navigated the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean before, faced storms, sickness, and doubt. But this was different. He was not only a sailor now, he was a force, and the world knew it. As they sailed toward India, the mood aboard the ships was tense. The sea, once full of promise and mystery, now felt like a stage set for battle. The crew moved with purpose, their faces hardened by months of preparation, their eyes sharp, knowing full well what awaited them. Vasco, his face calm but determined, paced the deck, his thoughts racing ahead to the shores of India. His first voyage had been about discovery, about finding the sea route, about opening trade, but this time it was about ensuring Portugal's dominance. The Indian Ocean would no longer be a place where the Portuguese were guests. No, they would rule it. The days passed slowly, the endless stretch of water before them, the sun beating down mercilessly. But Vasco's will never wavered. He had become one with the sea, understanding its moods, its dangers. He had faced it all before, and now he was ready to face it again. Finally, the coast of India appeared on the horizon, the familiar sight of Calicut, where he had once landed with dreams of trade and peace. But this time the air felt different. The tension was thicker, the stakes higher. Vasco knew that his arrival would not be welcomed with open arms. The last time he had left Calicut, the Zamorin had grown hostile, refusing to give Portugal full control of the spice trade. This time, Vasco would not ask. As the fleet anchored in the harbor, the people of Calicut gathered along the shore, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. The sight of 20 Portuguese warships was not something they could ignore. The once peaceful trader had returned as a conqueror, and they knew it. Vasco's eyes scanned the coast, and he spoke quietly to his officers. "We will not leave this time without what we came for. The seas are ours." The days that followed were tense. Vasco sent word to the Zamarin demanding tribute, demanding that Portugal's interests be protected. The response was slow, hesitant. The Zamarin, proud and unwilling to bend to foreign power, delayed, hoping to avoid conflict. But Vasco would not wait. He had not come to ask. He had come to take. When word finally arrived that the Zamarin would not submit to Portugal's demands, Vasco did what he had come to do. He unleashed the power of his fleet. The cannons roared, their thunderous blasts echoing across the water, shaking the very foundations of the city. The Portuguese ships, with their superior firepower, bombarded Calicut, sending a clear message: the seas belong to Portugal now. The people of Calicut, unprepared for such force, fled in terror as the Portuguese fleet laid siege to the harbor. Vasco's men, trained and ready for battle, launched an assault on the city, determined to break the Zamarin's resistance. It was brutal. It was swift. Vasco had made his point. But even as the smoke from the cannons cleared and the sound of battle faded, Vasco knew that this was only the beginning. The Indian Ocean was vast, and though Calicut had felt the weight of Portuguese power, there were others, Arab traders, local rulers, who would resist. But Vasco was ready. He had become a legend now, a man both feared and respected. The boy who had once dreamed of far-off lands had become a force to be reckoned with, a man whose name was known from Lisbon to India, whose fleet was the most feared in the Indian Ocean. The return to the East had not been a journey of discovery, but of domination. Vasco da Gama had not just found the sea route to India, he had claimed it. As the fleet sailed from Calicut, the city now in ruins behind them, Vasco stood at the helm, his eyes once again on the horizon. There was no joy in victory, no celebration, only the knowledge that this was what had to be done. Once the sea has you, he whispered to himself, it never lets you go. He had answered the call once more, and he knew there would be other voyages, other battles. The sea still held many secrets, many challenges. Vasco da Gama had returned to the east, but his journey was far from over. Chapter 12. Legacy of a Pioneer. Every great journey ends, but its story lives on. Vasco da Gama's journey had begun as a dream, a boy staring out at the endless ocean, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. But now, his journey had become legend. The years had passed, the seas had been conquered, and the world had changed. Vasco da Gama, the boy who once ran along the shores of Sines with salt in his hair and dreams in his heart, was now a man of power, of wealth, and of respect. In his final years, Vasco's life was filled with titles and honors. He was no longer just an explorer. He was the Viceroy of India, a man who oversaw the empire he had helped to build. The King of Portugal trusted him with one of the greatest tasks of all, maintaining Portugal's dominance in the Indian Ocean, keeping the spice trade flowing, and ensuring that the wealth of the East would forever belong to his homeland. But for Vasco, it was not the titles that mattered. It was not the wealth. It was the sea. Always. The sea. He had carved a path between Europe and India, a sea route that would change the world forever. He had opened the gates to the East, forging a new connection between distant lands, bringing cultures together, through trade, through diplomacy, and sometimes through force. His voyages had broken barriers, shattered the limits of what was thought possible. The world was no longer bound by the land. Now, the oceans were the highways of empire. But even as Vasco grew older, even as the weight of his years began to press down on him, the sea never left him. He may have worn the robes of a nobleman, may have carried the authority of a viceroy, but in his heart he was still that boy by the shore, listening to the crash of the waves, feeling the pull of the ocean in his blood. In 1524, Vasco da Gama returned to India for the last time. He had been appointed once again to bring order to the Portuguese colony, to restore control and assert the power of his nation. But this time, the journey felt different. He was no longer the fiery young explorer, charging into the unknown with nothing but ambition to guide him. Now, he was a man who had seen the world, its beauty, its danger, its endless possibilities. But the journey had taken its toll. Vasco's health began to fail. The long months at sea, the years of harsh conditions, the battles fought, both against nature and man, they had worn him down. The man who had once seemed invincible now felt the weight of his years pressing on his shoulders. Yet, even as illness began to consume him, Vasco never lost his resolve. His mind was as sharp as ever, his will unbreakable. In December of that year, in the city of Cochin, India, Vasco da Gama took his final breath. The seas he had once sailed now seemed far away, the adventures of his youth a distant memory. But his legacy was carved into the very fabric of history. Vasco da Gama had opened a new chapter in the story of the world. The sea route to India, once thought impossible, was now a lifeline for the Portuguese Empire. The spices, the silks, the treasures of the East flowed into Europe, changing economies, cultures, and the very course of history. And it was Vasco who had made it all possible. His death marked the end of a life, but not the end of his story. The voyages he had undertaken, the risks he had faced, the dreams he had chased, all of it lived on in the ships that continued to sail the seas he had conquered. Every Portuguese sailor who set out for India, every merchant who traded in the spices of Calicut, owed their journey to Vasco da Gama. He had become more than a man. He had become a legend. In Portugal, his name was spoken with reverence, with awe. The king honored him. His family was given titles, lands, and wealth. Statues would be raised in his memory, and his story would be told to generations of explorers and dreamers. The boy who once gazed at the horizon had become the man who sailed beyond the edge of the known world, and in doing so, had expanded the boundaries of what humanity believed was possible. Even now, centuries later, the name Vasco da Gama is remembered, not just as a sailor, not just as a viceroy, but as a pioneer, a man who dared to dream and who had the courage to follow that dream to the ends of the earth. His story, like the sea itself, never truly ends.